everybody, I'm Jill Redfern. Welcome to Third Shift Movement Shop, home of literal technique. This tutorial is about alignment of the skull. So let's start back a couple steps before we get to the skull and just take a look at the 33 vertebrae. This is our first vertebrae and the tailbone is number 33. So this whole spinal column is what I call the 33 vertebrae. I always refer to it as the 33 vertebrae. You can see that we have anatomical curves in the 33 vertebrae. This curve is into the body, which is called lordosis. This curve is away from the body, which is called kyphosis. We switch back to lordosis, and then we have another kyphosis. So this is an anatomical curve. Before we do anything, before we flex, extend, or rotate, 33 vertebrae have an anatomical curve. So this is our starting point. When we talk about finding neutral alignment of the 33 vertebrae, we're talking about finding this anatomical curve in one structure. Okay, great. So the cervical vertebrae is what we're going to talk about today because that is where the skull finds its alignment when we dance. So first, let's point out a couple things about the skull that I'm going to point out largely because that's where we have muscle attachment. Literal technique talks about 12 muscles that are fundamental to dance technique, and muscle attachments happen at two places on the skull. One is in this area, and if you can see this little jagged mark into skeleton's skull, this is the occipital bone. Here, on the other side of this jagged mark, is the temporal bone, and this is the mastoid process, which is a projection off of the temporal bone where a muscle will attach. But we also have a muscle attachment at about this place on the occipital bone. So just two things, two aspects of the skull to just keep in the back of your mind. Okay, so the thing about the skull is that it attaches to this one structure at the first cervical vertebrae. There's a direct bone-to-bone connection and a joint is formed. That joint allows us to flex and extend the skull. And in this instance, flexion is happening forward, extension happens back. So we have back and front, flexion and extension. We can also flex the skull side to side, and it's going to happen at the same place with a little help from the cervical vertebrae. The second cervical vertebrae forms a joint with the first one. That allows us to move the skull side to side. So we can do this, which is called rotation. We have rotation in the vertebrae. So the cervical vertebrae, and there are 7, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. The cervical vertebrae can flex, extend, and rotate. They curve into the body at anywhere from 20 to 35 degrees, and that depends on the person. But they do curve in. The flexion and extension is anywhere from 10 to 20 degrees, depending on the person. And then rotation is approximately 45 degrees. So give or take based on the vertebrae that you're talking about. So we can do those things with the skull. The vertebrae, the others, 3 through 7, also have the ability to flex, extend, and rotate But for the most part, when we're moving the skull around, the flexion, extension, and rotation is happening up here, closer to the skull. So that's important when we talk about technique, because if you're like me, it's very likely that in your early training, the kinds of corrections that you got about alignment of the skull had to do with the position of the chin in space. Drop the chin, raise the chin's too high, stuff like that. The issue with that as a correction is that it doesn't acknowledge that the alignment of the skull actually is derived at the vertebrae. So if you want to correct alignment of the skull, it has to happen at the vertebrae. And you can do a slight side to side, up and down, to find that neutral place. So there's a lot of movement, choreographic movement, that's going to take your head in all kinds of different places. But when you want to, it's important to understand where alignment and neutrality is in order to come back to it, so you know where you're coming from and where you're returning to. So when it comes to technique, knowing that the skull is getting its alignment right up here at the top is really important. Okay. This week in your class, whenever you're upright and the skull isn't, doing any kinds of fancy movements or whatever, bobblehead movements, think about aligning the skull from the vertebrae. Anytime you find yourself, and you can put your fingers on that place on the skull, and you can feel when you are flexed and extended instead of neutral. So try that while you're in your early warm-up of class, either at the bar or in the center, and see what that does for you. Okay, I'll see you next week.